Hello, everyone. I'm Patrick Cronin, Asia Pacific Security Chair at the Hudson Institute. And for this program, I'll be joined by four highly respected national security experts, two from South Korea and two from the United States, to think through the challenges North Korea may pose in the months ahead. Now, the Korean Peninsula may not rank among the first tier issues facing the incoming Biden administration. The peninsula is not as vital as, say, curbing COVID-19, at least for Americans right now, rebuilding the economy, putting in place strategies to manage China or even climate change. But the peninsula remains a wild card. The value of the Koreas could spike quickly with little or no warning. And even absent a sudden crisis or a breakthrough, the Korean Peninsula, which occupies a territory smaller than Laos, will continue to play an outsized role in US national security policy during the Biden era. Recall how the peninsula has been a major power crossroads throughout history, and that the outbreak of war in 1950 militarized an incipient US containment strategy toward the Soviet bloc. 3 decades after the Cold War ended with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, more than 23,000 US troops remain forward-based in South Korea. That's because North Korea has added formidable nuclear and missile capabilities to its large conventional forces, and the dictatorial Kim family regime has never forsworn its goal of unification on Pyongyang's terms. But time has not been on North Korea's side, from my perspective. Over the past 7.5 decades, the people of South Korea emerged out of colonization, conflict, poverty, and political oppression to forge a resilient democracy with increasing defensive military breadth in an enviable economy, accounting for 2% of global GDP. That's larger than Russia's economy. Today, the ROK is not only one of America's strongest allies, it is an essential player for shaping the future peace in Northeast Asia and the rules and institutions of tomorrow's world order. But what might President-elect Joe Biden face from North Korea and the Korean Peninsula? As the title of this program suggests, Diplomacy, Deterrence, and Disruption, Navigating North Korea Policy in 2021, taking stock of US and ROK-US alliance negotiating strategy, defense posture, and preparation for contingency is a natural part of the transition between American administrations. Should the United States and South Korea extend a diplomatic olive branch to North Korea, for instance, by returning to the idea of a small deal designed to freeze nuclear programs at Yongbyon in exchange for some reduction in sanctions? How would such an incremental approach fit in with America's longstanding goal of achieving a final, fully verified denuclearization of North Korea? And how will Biden's approach to North Korea affect President Moon Jae-in's objective of transforming inter-Korean relations? More concretely, what are the strategic implications of North Korea's burgeoning nuclear-armed missile programs? Despite summit meetings and diplomatic engagement, especially in 2018 and 2019, Pyongyang's nuclear stockpile is estimated to include at least 20 to 30 warheads. Some say it could be twice that, with fissile material for many more weapons. The monstrous road mobile ICBM showcased on parade in October, along with Hwasong 15 ICBMs, indicates a desire to impress various audiences. But the ostentatious display of nuclear weapons leads me to ask, is deterrence secure and stable? And is South Korea reassured by US extended deterrence? The answers to questions about diplomacy and deterrence may both turn on what disruptions, provocations, events, and initiatives take place in the ensuing months. Will Kim Jong-un approach President Biden with a cudgel or with a carrot, a weapons test or a charm offensive? The Biden administration may wish for a root and branch policy review of its North Korea policy and a new deliberative diplomatic process to unfold slowly while working on urgent domestic issues. But North Korea also has a vote in this relationship. The questions we are asking today are relevant to near-term policy, but they also relate to a Hudson study we are writing about North Korea and threat perceptions that will be published in March. I want to give a special thanks to the Korea Foundation, whose support made this event and the study both possible and better by deepening ROK-US dialogue on critical issues. Now, finally, to help us catalyze today's dialogue, I'm delighted to be joined on this program by four outstanding panelists, each of whom brings tremendous expertise to security and North Korea policy. They are Dr. Wang Ji-wan, Associate Professor in the International Relations Department at the University of Seoul and among other things, an expert on inter-Korean relations and diplomacy. Andrea Mihailescu is the State Department Fellow in Residence at Pepperdine University. Her work in the State and Defense Departments has elevated economic elements of statecraft, and she helped design North Korean sanctions policy during the Obama administration. Dr. Park Won-gon is Professor of International Studies and Vice Dean of the Gray School at Handong Global University. He serves as a member of the Policy Advisory Board at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and has in past served in a similar capacity at the National Intelligence Service, Ministry of National Unification, and Ministry of National Defense. And finally, Dr. Brad Roberts. He's the director of the Center for Global Security Research at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. Dr. Roberts served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear and Missile Defense Policy, and he's been a leading thinker and policy architect with respect to nuclear posture and alliance extended deterrence, among other security issues. Now, I have 4 basic questions, and the first begins with the diplomatic approach to North Korea and what might be at stake. And let me begin with Dr. Wong. And for those watching the live taping of this program, to repeat what Phil said, feel free to ask a question in the chat function, and time permitting, we will seek to address it. Dr. Wong, how do you think President Moon should or will approach the next phase of diplomacy with North Korea? What changes as a result of working with a new Biden administration? Over to you.
Okay. First of all, thanks a lot for inviting me here to the wonderful the seminar. I think that recently the Victor Cha talked about the mini deal in a big deal, and I think it's very encouraging. Even the Victor Cha is talking about the small deal, diplomacy, negotiation. Also, although this is also important in the big deal, but the thing is that the Biden's foreign policy is somewhat different foreign policy towards North Korea. Most people expect that Biden's North Korea policy looks like that of the Obama strategic patience, that the Biden, but I think that Biden should not look like Obama on North Korea. And I think that he cannot even adopt the policy because the situation has changed a lot since President Obama left. So Obama's policy of strategic patience, I think that presupposes that the North Korean threat is neither serious nor imminent to the United States. So the Obama administration kept patient strategically on North Korea, and I think they waited for the regime to change its course of action. Because the Obama administration believed that the United States still had enough time to resolve the North Korean nuclear and missile issues, the North Korean threat seems to be neither serious nor the imminent. But in the meantime, the United States at that time wanted China to resolve the North Korean problem. But the thing is that the Biden administration should keep in mind that the strategic patience is no longer possible. So actually, after Obama left, the North Korea conducted, the 6th nuclear test and several more the ballistic missile, long-range missile tests, especially after North Korean test fired the Hudson 15, that ICBM class rocket in November 2017. North Korea declared the completion of the nuclear deterrence capability against the United States. So we can say that North Korea is no longer a remote threat. North Korea is not a legal, nuclear weapon state, but a de facto nuclear weapon state. So even the President Obama at that time reportedly warned that the President-elect the Trump of the considering North Korea to be the top national security priority. So the strategic patience will not work for Biden, but he should go beyond the Obama's North Korea policy. So I think that Biden needs to understand that the Kim Jong-un wants to secure his regime guarantee in return for the denuclearization. For the last 3 decades, the negotiation between the U.S. and the North Korea was like the trade-off between the North Korea's denuclearization and the North Korea regime guarantee. So since North Korea's security problems are focusing on the abandonment of the, actually they argue that the problem is that the U.S. hostile policy toward the North Korean regime. So North Korea will ultimately seek to fundamentally change the U.S. policy toward North Korea. So Biden's North Korea policy, I think, should begin with a small step in which the United States and North Korea can narrow down their differences and exchange several detailed agendas. But two countries, the U.S. and North Korea, try to narrow down their differences at Hanoi, the February the last year, 2019, but they failed. There are lots of reasons why they failed in the negotiation. But anyway, in this sense, it's really important for the Biden administration to come up with a new idea of how to resolve, the North Korean issue. In this sense, I think that Victor Charles' recent proposal of the mini deal or small deal, big deal is quite plausible and quite encouraging. Let me stop here.
Well, that's excellent. Let's turn to Andrea and get a kind of an American view, although one from academia at the moment, not from policy, but one policy informed from her deep experience on sanctions and other issues, including her recent foreign policy article. Andrea, over to you.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you for having me. First, I'd like to note that all views are my own. They don't reflect any agency or any agency views, whether it be government or Pepperdine. So again, thank you for having me. Well, with regards to looking at it from sanctions, I'm going to first say that when we're thinking about sanctions, sanctions has become so much a nomenclature that it actually encompasses pressure writ large. And there are other authorities and other enforcement mechanisms that not only Treasury's OFAC uses, but also Commerce and Department of Justice and FinCEN, and there's the 311 action. And I would like to note that if I do use sanctions and pressure interchangeably, I first and foremost apologize to my former colleagues at the Treasury, Commerce, and Justice Department. So as the next administration thinks about sanctions, I like to think about sanctions policy as supporting four goals. And first of all, how does sanctions policy support, and by sanctions again, sanctions policy, sanctions and pressure, how does it support the broader foreign policy approach to North Korea? Because sanctions is just one basket of tools in an administration's approach to North Korea. And so as the next administration is thinking about the broader approach, the end goal obviously could be denuclearization of the peninsula, but is it just denuclearization of the peninsula? How does human rights fit into that? How does the missile program fit into that? And then you have to think about how do sanctions and the pressure tools that are available to the administration fit into that? And of course, then how do you think about your relationship with other countries as you're engaging in diplomacy and coordinating pressure tactics? So that leads me to number two, ensuring the implementation of existing authorities. And I will actually break that down into two further aspects, and that is ensuring the implementation of existing authorities with allies and partners, for instance, Japan and South Korea, to name two, there are many others. And then there's, of course, the UN Security Council resolutions and enforcement of those and the coordination of allies and partners in that framework. And then the second component of that, in the aspect of ensuring the implementation of existing authorities, is our sanctions enforcement with China and our sanctions enforcement with Russia. And what is the messaging that we would like to articulate to Russia and to China, and as well as to our partners and allies, and how do we strengthen those authorities? And we also have to think about, so my advice to the next administration is, given the fact that so much of North Korea's money laundering activities, and as DAS Alex Wong recently called out China for its engagement and its prohibitive activity in supporting the North Korean regime, how does the Biden administration think about its approach with China? My recommendation would be, as I noted in my foreign policy article, is to create a sort of framework, a bilateral working group that is solely focused on implementing the UN Security Council resolutions. And that group would meet regularly and frequently. I know sanctions take time, commitment, and resources. And this will be a time commitment and resource, but the long run, it will pay off if you have that frequent and ongoing engagement with China, and highlighting to Chinese, using US technical experts to highlight, to share what information we see passing through Chinese borders, and then China could share that information with the United States. Of course, these steps will be incremental, and it will take time to build up that relationship. But once you have that sustained engagement, we will start to see progress in that. And I could talk about that a little bit later if you'd like. And the third one is looking at it from the aspect of, do we need to create new authorities? We haven't seen a UN Security Council resolution since 2017. If North Korea engages in another missile launch or another nuclear test, then are we going to have another UN Security Council resolution? Of course, we've seen dozens of missile launches since 2017 through most recently, but there has been no UN Security Council resolution. And why is that? The UN panel of experts has submitted a number of recommendations in their annual reports as to how we can strengthen our resolutions and how we can adopt new designations, and we should probably take that into consideration for sure. And then the last item that I would like to highlight is, how do we make this all a reality? And it's such a difficult aspect in terms of the diplomatic engagement. We're going to have to isolate North Korea, the regime, and Kim Jong-un's inner circle. And that has to be a concerted effort where we have sustained engagement with China, with Russia, with our partners and allies in terms of cutting off North Korea's illicit criminal activities in terms of how it's able to fund and finance its weapons program. And that includes diplomatic engagement, cutting North Korea off diplomatically, and cutting the North Korean regime off from other angles that it normally has access to. And that's where, going back, and again, these are not mutually exclusive, these four prongs that I'm recommending, but the fact that the China-US working group would also help facilitate the dialogue and the ongoing discussion between the United States and China, and also seeing where the illicit activity is taking place, and thereby helping with respect to the fourth item of isolating the North Korean regime. And I will stop there.
Excellent. We'll come back to some of those questions in the second round with you, but I want to turn to Dr. Park and get his view generally on where he thinks we're going with North Korea.
Okay, first of all, thank you for inviting me this very meaningful round table. But I think there is some clear differences between the new Biden administration and South Korean government policy toward the North Korea. And I think Biden administration will emphasize so-called democratic value. And Biden himself mentioned several times. And he also criticized Trump's meeting with Kim Jong-un. And he's not going to have this kind of meeting with authoritarian leaders. So it is, we can easily imagine that the Biden administration is going back to the more traditional way to approach the denuclearization talk, which means that so-called bottom up and put the emphasis on the working level talk and then high level. And finally, if necessary, they have chance to meet like the summit as the Trump did. And also Biden administration, I don't think they have any intention to give some kind of incentive force to rather the tightening sanctions to bring the North Korea into the negotiation table. On the other hand, the South Korean government, Moon Jae-in government, and it is well-known fact that they prefer the so-called top-down approach. And then that's why some of the South Korean government officials and unofficially mentioned that they prefer the Trump's re-election rather than Biden. And also, it is known that the South Korean government wanted to give some incentive to North Korea, and it's well-known fact that still advocate to have the end of war declaration. And also, South Korean government wanted to resume the joint inter-Korean projects, such as Kumgang Mountain Tour and Kaesong Industrial Complex, although it's very difficult, and I think it's almost impossible because of the sanction. So, in my view, it is important to have a same approach. I mean, United States and South Korea should be in the same page. And about the Biden administration denuclearization plan, and in a sense, I think it's a little bit similar to the Trump administration's approach. I mean, the Steve Biegun's plan is like a step-by-step with the corresponding measures. And in Korea, the Tony Blinken, the appointee of the Secretary of State, and his article in New York Times on June 29 was widely circulated. And he put the emphasis on so-called freeze, because it is true that North Korea has never stopped to develop their nuclear and the missile capabilities. So it is important to stop and freeze their the development process, and then have some kind of a monitoring, and then give us some, if necessary, give some the partial relief of the sanctions. But important thing is that we cannot go in that way. I mean, back to, as the Professor Hwang mentioned, the last Hanoi, the United States and North Korea, they are talking about this Yongbyon facility first, but the Trump administration, they wanted to have a more, the so-called Yongbyon plus ARPA, and ARPA means that including some uranium enriched facilities, but North Korea never accept this to have include the uranium enriched facilities. So important thing is that even the freeze, not just the Yongbyon facility, but also it has to include the other uranium enriched facilities. But there's no, I think, a very slight chance to accept this kind of demand by the North Korea. So still, I think it is very difficult to have resume the negotiation between United States and North Korea.
Well, thank you very much. We'll come back for a second round, but I want to turn to Brad Roberts and sort of get his advice on what he would be telling President-elect Biden right now as the Biden administration in waiting is thinking about diplomacy with North Korea, maybe thinking about a smaller deal, arms control, if you will, maybe the freeze idea. Who knows whether it can come to fruition. But where do we stand vis-a-vis North Korea's weapons programs and what that means for security in the region? And what would a freeze mean in terms of defense and security implications, or the failure to reach some kind of a break on North Korea's weapons program, where that might be heading if it's sort of uncurbed entirely? But any subset of those questions, Brad Roberts, over to you.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you for the opportunity to join this distinguished group. Let me also add my disclaimer that I'm speaking for myself and not for any organization. And my advice to the president-elect would be to have low expectations of moving off the path we've been on. We Americans love to get out the reset button at every election. And the reset button is, of course, a reference to the button in the US-Russian relationship, so to speak, that the Obama administration pulled out in 2009. This is the strength of our system, of course, that we periodically renew and redebate. But we have to accept that in Pyongyang is an actor who doesn't have to periodically renew and redebate, and who seems well set on a particular course of action. And maybe he can be dislodged from that course through a new set of incentives and rewards. And we should definitely try. But I think we should take the lesson from history that our optimism has generally gone unmet. And even a freeze seems to me to be unlikely in the circumstance. On the contrary, I would expect provocations rather than a freeze. But maybe we'll see the olive branch instead. It's worth the test. But even a freeze leaves in place what's essentially an existential threat to the Republic of Korea and possibly also to Japan. If that many nuclear weapons, Patrick, that you mentioned have been mated to long-range delivery systems, many cities, many targets would be vulnerable. And of course, there is some nascent capability, exactly how much to target the United States. How much is unclear, but there is a nascent capability. We're not in a relationship of mutual assured destruction, but we're moving into a situation where North Korea will, over the coming few years, and not many years, gain the ability to put much of the American homeland at risk. this is a fundamentally new and different circumstance. And I believe the Biden administration will continue the practice of the last 3 or 4 administrations in seeking to adapt and strengthen the alliance's deterrence posture to deal with emerging threats, and including emerging nuclear threats. But I think the next decision points in front of the alliance on how to do that are going to be more difficult and more controversial. So I am confident the administration will confront those difficult decisions and make them. But I think the presence of a distinct and substantial nuclear threat to 2 allies and to the United States will color our view of what's necessary to do to ensure that deterrence remains effective.
Well, Brad, you've summed up the conundrum very well. This is an extremely serious challenge, and yet there's not a lot of flexibility for high expectations here, and we shouldn't have high expectations. And that is the challenge. So I want to move into developing a little further your thinking of all 4 of you, especially related to deterrence and stability issues that, in fact, Brad's really just addressed. Thinking also about the possibility of formalizing a moratorium on the nuclear tests and the long-range missile tests that may or may not be in place tacitly, since Kim Jong-un kind of wavered on whether that still applies. But for better or worse, since end of 2017, there hasn't been a nuclear test or a long-range missile test. And I wonder whether that would be worthwhile. But Dr. Wong, turning back to you on how, in a South Korean perspective, you're viewing the stability of deterrence, because there's not the sense in general from the Moon administration that that's as urgent a problem as it's generally seen in the national security community in Washington. And yet at the same time, we're going to get back to Andrea's questions on sanctions. I'm not sure there's the appetite for keeping up as much pressure as might be needed to kind of reinvigorate the kind of pressure element of a diplomatic approach. If we're only going in with carrots to North Korea, we're not sure how effective that's going to be. We're not sure how effective the carrot stick approach is either. So how do you see stability of deterrence, including whether, if there's a provocation, is North Korea assuming that there will be no strong risk of retaliation to a provocation?
Okay, I think that the deterrence of the Korean Peninsula once failed in 1950, but since that, in general, I think the deterrence has worked for the last 7 decades, mainly because of the Korea-U.S. alliance. Was very stable and strong. And also regarding the Pyongyang's nuclear program, Pyongyang has insisted that its nuclear and missile programs are designed to deter the United States from attacking North Korea. Although the North Korea often, threatens to strike South Korea and the U.S. territory, it has argued for its own nuclear the deterrence capability. So of course, we cannot trust North Korea's argument. They are very threatening. But actually, it is very quite clear that the deterrence has worked for the last 7 decades on the Korean Peninsula, especially the United States extended deterrence is important, I think. And the U.S. extended deterrence was critical in sustaining the peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula. In this sense, the U.S. and South Korea has, cooperated very closely for the last 7 decades. But it seems to me that the Trump administration is a little outlier. But anyway, even in this year's joint communique of the 52nd U.S. ROK Security Consultative Meeting, the 2 nations reaffirmed that the continued U.S. commitment to provide extended deterrence to the ROK using the full range of military capabilities, including the U.S. nuclear, conventional, and missile defense capability. There was the quotation from the U.S. ROK SCM this year. So the United States and the ROK are the committee to ensure that the alliance, Korea-US alliance, the deterrence posture remains credible and capable and enduring. The SCM, the use that terms. So I think that in this sense that US ROK joint military exercises should be sustained for now in order to strengthen the deterrence against the North Korea, unless there is a serious change in North Korea's military threat. So, that President Trump talked about the suspension of the joint exercises, joint US ROK military exercises, and the reduction of the US troops from ROK without any prior consultation with the Korean government. Actually, when he met with Kim Jong-un in Singapore in June 2018. So I think that it is not really helpful for the continued deterrence strategy against North Korea. So for the last 7 decades, the deterrence has worked. In general, it's okay. It's the United States and South Korea has cooperated very closely in order to strengthen and upgrade the deterrence. But the Trump administration's, the alliance policy was a little, the outlier in that sense. Given that 70 years of the US ROK, the alliance. So for the Biden administration, it's really important to renew that kind of continued, this strengthening of the US ROK alliance, and it's really important, also important to consult with each other in how to, the respond to the North Korea's rising threat and how to resolve the North Korean nuclear issues. Thank you.
Well, prior consultation with allies on such serious issues is extremely important. It's a good sign that Jake Sullivan, who's being tapped to be the national security advisor for the Biden administration, tweeted out yesterday a very strong, clear signal to Australia about kind of what I called a burgeoning Biden doctrine by declaring that the United States will stand by its democratic allies and find solutions together and work very closely with them. At least an early indicator that they're going to take consultation with allies more seriously than has been taken recently. I want to turn back to Andrea and have her follow up a bit on 2 different facets of the sanctions question as we think about how they'll play out in deterrence and keeping stability. One of them is the enforcement of sanctions that you alluded to, quoting Alex Wong, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, about the challenge of sanctions enforcement in China. There are actually 2 schools of thought that I've heard out of Korea and the United States about China. One of them holds that China actually has been enforcing sanctions better than in recent years. And they started to do this in the last quarter of last year, in fact, when manufacturing across from China to North Korea took a nosedive. So even before COVID set in, China appeared to be enforcing sanctions. But the other view is the one you've just mentioned, which is no, China seems to be a big factor in facilitating North Korean smuggling of banned energy and goods. And so I'd be very interested in what you think is the appetite for working with China. You've called for a working group to look at these issues, UN Security Council sanctions, but is there going to be the appetite internationally for the enforcement of sanctions to kind of keep up pressure? The flip side of that, and this is the question of incentives, you raised in your intriguing article in Foreign Policy that any sanctions relief should start with the vertically integrated industries, and then the sanctions on weapons related programs should stay in place. And I wonder whether you can elaborate on that. So over to you.
Thank you, Patrick. So I'll start off with your first comment about enforcement. I think that's part of probably a 2-part question, and looking at the enforcement challenges and then looking at the China angle, the working group, and then go over to how to think about phasing in the sanctions and looking at the vertical sanctions versus the horizontal, the vertical industries versus the horizontal industries, and the challenges of relieving some of that pressure. So with regards to enforcement of sanctions, are a tool, and you can certainly adopt sanctions and issue sanctions, but sanctions aren't going to enforce themselves. And we have seen that from China that there has been a mix of sanctions enforcement in certain areas. They have enforced in other areas they haven't enforced, and depends on who you talk to. You're going to hear, no, China hasn't been enforcing, or China, yes, China has been enforcing in certain areas. And yes, where China has been enforcing in certain areas, it does deserve to be praised. At the end of the day, it is US leadership who drives the initiative to prompt countries to enforce sanctions. If countries see that the United States, as we've seen in the last administration, where dialogue began between the United States and North Korea, and where the United States messages on the sanctions enforcement, if we believe that sanctions are if dialogue should continue and there's no messaging on sanctions as dialogue continues, then countries are going to lapse on their sanctions enforcement capabilities, or they're going to have mixed responses to sanctions enforcement, sanctions that are that they feel that are challenging to their own equities, and they will enforce where they feel that it compromises the integrity of their country. So yes, there are elements of enforcement that should be praised and elements of enforcement that haven't been enforced. But with regards to, there are still a number of, as Alex Wong said, money laundering, prohibitive trade that continues in steel, in coal, in textiles, in iron ore. And that needs to be stopped. I'm not talking about the sanctions that have been enforced, it's the sanctions that haven't been enforced. And yes, maybe the United States needs to do a better job of messaging where sanctions enforcement has taken place, but some countries don't want that. They want to keep it private. And there may be a good reason for that, so we will keep that silent. But where the sanctions enforcement needs improvement, and there's a lot of improvement given the volume of North Korean illicit activity taking place through Chinese borders, as even the recent Department of Justice enforcement actions highlighted this year with respect to the cyber activity taking place and the Chinese facilitators involved in those activities, as well as money laundering activities and the Chinese involvement in that aspect. So with regards to the working group would be an opportunity, a mechanism where US technical experts would meet with Chinese technical experts. They would share information where they see cross-border middleman activities taking place, and identify ways as to identify patterns and trends as to how that activity is taking place, and work together on asking the Chinese and pressing the Chinese, urging the Chinese to stop that activity from taking place. With regards to the what I was talking about in my paper on the horizontal and the vertical industries, of course, the face-to-face engagement that I was referring to is something that's going to take time. It's going to take years, if not decades, between the two countries, before we can even come to it, if we come to an agreement. So it might not be politically palatable for one administration to pursue, but if we do have the opportunity to engage in negotiations and open that opportunity for dialogue again, where it is meaningful and we make headway, we're going to have to think about how we're going to think about relieving pressure. And by pressure, it's sanctions and enforcement actions. The first step that I would recommend is what North Korea needs most, and that's food and medicine. The people of North Korea needs food and medicine. But what North Korea wants, and what we want to give to North Korea in that phased in approach to freezing its facilities in and around Yeonbyong, are probably two different wants. Our want with addressing the needs of the people of North Korea by providing the food and medicine is probably not something that North Korea wants. North Korea will want some of the sanctions lifted on key sectors that help fund the regime's coffers. And we want to ensure that that funding and that financing, if we did lift sanctions or thought about sanctions easing, how to do that in such a way that North Korea then doesn't use that funding to finance its weapons program or cyber activities. So that is something that the administration will have to think about calibrating that that engagement, and with the phase-to-phase approach, my recommendation would be to look at focusing on food and medicine and how to message that to North Korea, because the North Korean people largely need the food and medicine and yes, and North Korea will not probably be responsive to that initiative, but we'll have to find the middle ground and how to start negotiating that. So it's easier to lift sanctions. It's easier to snap back sanctions on sectors that are vertically integrated. So for instance, textiles is the supply chain is very murky. There are lots of different actors, distributors, suppliers involved in that sector of the economy. And if we were to pull back some of the sanctions on the textiles, it would be difficult to snap those back just because there are so many players in that industry that it would be hard to go after them again. And so we would want to reserve the more difficult industries where it's harder to snap back sanctions like textiles for the very last stage of negotiation, whenever that stage will be, and look at the more easier approach. So I would start with food and medicine, then look at more vertically integrated industries that are easier to then put the sanctions back on. Thank you.
Terrific. Yeah. And Dr. Pak, I wanted to just follow up with one quick question for you, although it's a difficult one, about the pandemic and whether North Korea would trust anybody's vaccine as, maybe through the World Health Organization, but even that, I'm just not sure that North Korea is prepared to trust anybody's vaccine, and yet they probably need it. But I really want to have you then turn to the basic question about deterrence. I mean, you've been watching this a long time. You teach at an international university. I mean, is the assumption that, Brad Roberts laid out pretty starkly, and I think accurately, a growing nuclear weapons arsenal with more means of delivery, isn't that just inherently a dangerous, accident or war waiting to happen? Or is the assumption, that this is just not going to be used? These weapons are going to accumulate and somehow they will never be used. It'll all be safe. Don't worry. Or is it something in between those two? But maybe the vaccine question in terms of aid, and then turning to you about your basic view of the stability of deterrence.
Okay, thank you. About the vaccine questions, and it is well-known fact that South Korea, even United States and international community, they are doing their best to help for the humanitarian purpose. You see, the North Korea has blocked their borders since January, and then they haven't opened their border. But problem is that North Korea hasn't received any kind of outside help. And Kim Jong-un himself publicly mentioned that he will not accept any kind of help, including the dealing with some equipment for the coronavirus. So at this very moment, I don't know how they can endure these kind of difficulties, but many people are saying that China is helping them. And we are seeing some kind of evidence that China is illegally, of course, that's violation of the economic sanction imposed by the United Nations, but they are helping them. So I think North Korea has any intention in near future to get any kind of help from the outside of the except China. So if vaccine is available, well, South Korean government mentioned several times, and then even especially the Minister of the National Unification, and he said that he will give some vaccine to North Korea, but there is no chance that the North Korea accept this kind of offer. And rather they are going to get some this vaccine from China. There's possibility. And second on your question about North Korea's nuclear weapon. Of course, nobody knows whether they are actually using this nuclear weapon or not. But it is a military purpose. Nobody knows how the very limited kind of a military conflict can escalate to full-fledged war. If there is some miscalculation and misperception with each other, I don't think we cannot rule out the possibility to use the nuclear weapon, because I think North Korea already have a new kind of a military operational plan, and that definitely includes their nuclear capability. So we cannot just say that, oh, the North Korea will just prepare for the conventional war. I don't think that's the case. And go back to your original questions about deterrence. I think this is a very important question because, well, Professor Huang is kind of give a credit that the deterrence capability with the ROK-US alliance, but I have a slightly different idea because recently it is true that this deterrence capability of the United States and South Korea alliance has been undermined, especially under the President Trump's administration. First, ROK-US haven't had enough military exercise, and because of the coronavirus, and also negotiation with North Korea, joint military deal continuously scaled down or postponed. So that's why very recently, the Combined Forces Command, the U.S. Forces Commander General Abrams raised concern that undermine alliance readiness. So that's the kind of very worrisome sign that we are facing right now. And also issue of a resumption of military exercise. And this coming next year, March, and South Korea and United States, we have a planned joint military exercise. And this is very important, especially you all know that the South Korean government, Moon Jae-in, is trying to transit wartime operational control to South Korea within his term. So this coming March exercise is very important to actualize this transition of the wartime operational control. But problem is that the North Korea will, very aggressively kind of a reaction about this joint military exercise. So I think this coming March is going to be one of the very critical juncture in terms of whether we can resume this peace process in the Korean Peninsula or the negotiation between the United States and North Korea. And that's the very important point. And second one is also relate to the missile defense. In South Korea, you see, we all know that the terminal high altitude area defense, so-called THAAD, still we cannot, formally place this THAAD system in Korea. Rather, we have a still temporary deployment. So I know one of the effective ways to deal with the North Korea's nuclear threat is to strengthen missile defense, but it's a very complicated issue, and China is very strongly opposed. And unfortunately, South Korea said 3 no's to China, which means that we are not going to deploy additional THAAD and etc. So it's going to undermine our deterrence capability against North Korea. And finally, about still the deterrence issue, I think it's related to the possible North Korea's provocation against South Korea. I think from the North Korean perspective, it's a safer choice rather than have this another round of launch of the ICBM test, because when North Korea decided to have a ICBM test, it will be a huge repercussion by both United States and China. You see, we all know that China is strongly opposed the North Korean's ICBM test because it will strengthen the trilateral cooperation among United States, Japan, and South Korea. And also, United States can bring the more missile defense system in this area. So I think North Korea might choose to have a limited provocation against South Korea, and we have already experienced it last June. Simply North Korea has blown up this Kaesong industrial complex. So I think overall the near future, especially for the next 6 months, is a very important month in terms of the deterrence of the North Korean threat.
Well, that's a good segue to Brad Roberts to sort of tease him out a bit more about the offense-defense balance, about the strength and how to strengthen extended deterrence in this environment, whatever happens with diplomacy in North Korea. And if I can even throw in the uncertainty about where Iran might be going and whether there might be further proliferation globally on nuclear weapons, and whether that sort of accelerates the pressure on something like extended deterrence of the ROK-US alliance. Brad?
Indeed, it does. I think the pressure on extended deterrence in the alliance is growing substantially, and for principally because of North Korea, but not exclusively. I have 3 main concerns about the alliance's deterrence strategy and posture overall. The first concern is about the balance between diplomacy and deterrence. The alliance has for decades pursued a balanced approach. We've sought diplomatic solutions to the North Korean nuclear problem while also ensuring that deterrence would be effective. as it has, as Professor Wong indicated and argued, including the extended nuclear component. But the balance was remade in the last few years. The exercise program dialed back. Other improvements that might have been made to the military posture, not made. In other words, we played down the deterrence component as essentially an incentive for the diplomatic track. And we have to rewrite that balance. And it's not clear that our diplomatic track is well served by so much restraint on the deterrence track. My second concern is that our deterrence strategy has to be trilateral. Yes, our military strategies are tailored to our separate alliance relationships, but the deterrence of nuclear-backed aggression by North Korea requires at least a coherent approach between the US ROK and US Japan alliances. And I don't think we've made enough progress in that regard. But my third and principal concern is about the nuclear part of the security umbrella. And it's not surprising to me that there are some prominent South Koreans arguing that in light of North Korea's nuclearization, South Korea should acquire nuclear weapons of its own. This is a debate that's always been there, but is rising and requires some sort of answer. And my concern is that we, the US ROK Alliance, have a nuclear deterrence umbrella that's the result of two decisions made in a very different security environment. One decision was in 1990, end of the Cold War, as a part of the presidential nuclear initiatives. President George H.W. Bush brought home all of the nuclear weapons from Asia and removed them from all naval surface combatants and put into storage some nuclear cruise missiles that could be fired from submarines. And basically said we would keep those in the contingency that there were a war in Northeast Asia for which they were relevant. The second decision came in 2009 as a part of the Obama administration's nuclear posture review, in which I was involved, in which the decision was made to retire the Tomahawks and to make a commitment to make globally available dual capable fighter bombers equipped with nuclear weapons in support of America's commitment to its allies anywhere. Now, all of those dual capable fighter bombers are currently and permanently forward deployed in Europe. So this was an umbrella that served its purpose for a long time. But we live in a different world. And it seems to me the key element that's missing from the alliance relationship for nuclear deterrence is a high-level consultative process. In the US-NATO relationship, if ever the time comes when the American president is deliberating employing a nuclear weapon in support of a commitment to NATO, there'd be a lot of consultation. There's a table in Brussels where that would occur, and there are guidelines on how the consultation would occur. South Koreans and our Japanese allies should both know where the table is, where this discussion would occur, and what the authorities would be in the case of employment of, or a decision about whether or not to employ nuclear weapons in defense of South Korea. So I think so my third concern is that this is work that's uncomfortable. Nobody likes to talk about nuclear deterrence. Nobody likes to talk about the prospect of employing nuclear weapons in a conflict. But our deterrence situation is eroding in the absence of these discussions.
Well, Brad, that's such important advice, and I'm sort of hopeful that's going to be taken quite seriously in the coming year. I want to turn back to Dr. Wong and sort of get his sense of the potential for Kim Jong-un to act up or act out in some way to try to elevate his issues to our agenda, onto the Biden administration's agenda, and possibly with a serious provocation, anything from a test of a missile or a nuclear weapon up through limited use of force. I've also got a question here about potential security guarantees or incentives that might be extended to the Kim regime, because in the Victor Cha foreignaffairs.com piece, for instance, in November, he talks about transforming the political relationship and making that the priority rather than trying to seek the holy grail of denuclearization, which seems so remote. Although political transformation may be just as equally difficult as denuclearization, but putting that aside, it does imply that a diplomatic approach would require some kind of security guarantees. That could be further reductions of military exercises, which we already heard is somewhat problematic, and that could actually undercut deterrence. So the way these things are related is very complicated. But Dr. Wong, how do you think about the potential for provocation, and about whether there are guarantees or measures that can be offered to North Korea to either resist those provocations or to come back to the bargaining table on terms that would be meaningful for South Korea and the United States?
Okay, I think that the North Korea will neither they conduct any serious provocations for the time being, nor they come back to the negotiation table. Actually, we remember that when the President Obama took office in 2008, the North Korea conducted the long-range missile launch, and also they conducted the nuclear test. Actually, the long-range missile launch when the Obama was prepared for the Prague, that famous speech that the world without nuclear weapons. So anyway, so for the time being, I do not think that the North Korea will conduct any serious provocations like the nuclear or the ICBM class missiles. For example, mainly because there is a UN sanction, and North Korea also, suffers from this very serious, the natural disasters, and also the critical thing is that the coronavirus, North Korea is now suffering from the corona self sanctions, and now concentrating on the responding to that. So whatever policy the Biden the administration puts in place, that Kim Jong-un, I think, seems to have his own the timetable. In fact, the inter-Korean and the U.S. North Korean summit meeting began with the Kim Jong-un's the Cham offensive initiative in 2018 New Year's address. Until we remember that until the end of the 2017, the North Korea conducted its sixth nuclear test and launched the Hwasong 15 rocket, right? Raised the crisis on the Korean Peninsula, and the Trump administration, considered at that time the bloody nose operation. So North Korea is not likely to respond to the U.S. leadership change in a different way, but North Korea has already, declared their so-called the head-on breakthrough strategy at the fifth planning meeting of the seventh, the Central Committee of the North Korean Workers' Party the last year. So North Korea decided to seek a long-term survival strategy against the United States. So I think that if the Biden returns to the Obama's the strategic patience, I hope not. But anyway, it will be more difficult to persuade North Korea to come back to the negotiation table. In this case, there is the high possibility that tensions between the North Korea and the United States will rise again, and that Kim Jong-un will no longer observe his self-imposed moratorium on nuclear and long-range missile testing. But I think that North Korea is now, because North Korea is now concentrating on dealing with the coronavirus. Of course, North Korea, declares itself as a COVID-free nation, because they say that there is no confirmed cases now as yet. But actually, although we cannot believe that there is no confirmed cases in North Korea, but it is quite, we can say that the North Korea has been quite successful in responding to COVID-19. That if the pandemic, spread inside North Korea, then North Korea would be very different from what it is now. So anyway, the North Korea is now, the main, the first priority of North Korea is now to respond to the COVID-19. So this may be the main reason for its quietness. So if the coronavirus, situation gets better, North Korea may move forward according to its own timetable. And before that, so it's necessary for the United States and South Korea need to think about what kind of policy, they can take to bring the North Korea back to the negotiation table. But for the time being, the North Korea, I don't think that North Korea will, come back to the negotiation table or conduct any serious the provocations, mainly because of the COVID-19, because that is the North Korea's first priority in the national strategy now. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Yes, it is curious that North Korea has reported some 9,000 suspected cases of COVID to the World Health Organization, but 0 confirmed cases, a perfect record on the part of North Korea. Who knew that North Korea might be good on lockdowns, right? But it turns out they're pretty good at regulating the people of North Korea. Joking aside, and turning back to Andrea, I'm reminded that with the world more online than ever because of the pandemic and because of technology, North Korea's got open running room for more cyber crime and a lot of illicit activities, areas they've been working in assiduously in the last decade in particular, I think. How would a working group kind of evaluate whether we're being effective on these areas, especially when you're dealing with cryptocurrencies and other things that are really hard to detect, at least for ordinary people outside? What exactly do you think this impact really has on the Kim family? I'm reminded of predictions in the mid-90s, even in the midst of famine, that they were about to collapse, and they, of course, got through that by adjusting their policies. I remember Paul French's book if I've got his name right, the journalist in 2015 wrote a very good book about North Korea as a paranoid state, but his thesis was that it was about to collapse. It was very brittle. And once again, that didn't seem to happen. They seem to get the ability to project at least continued wealth in Pyongyang around the Kim family. So what impact really, how should we be thinking about the role of sanctions relative to whether they're going to trigger a provocation or whether they're going to lead to successful diplomacy? And how do we measure any kind of progress?
Thank you, Patrick. That's quite a mouthful of a question with lots of different angles to consider. Let me start with the cyber one. Actually, the cyber topic is my favorite. So you can negotiate, or it's really, we've seen how hard it is to negotiate the nuclear angle and the missile angle and packaging that up and how to approach dialogue with regards to North Korea. And if you think figuring out a strategy as to how to engage North Korea on the denuclearization of the peninsula, imagine trying to negotiate something with North Korea on its illicit cyber program. That's almost next to impossible because one, North Korea is going to deny any illicit activity anywhere in the world with regards to its cyber program. And we've seen it attack even the Russians, Chinese, and the United States, and the various vaccine-related pharmaceutical organizations. So cyber, and it's developed its cyber capability, advanced its cyber capabilities very, very quickly and very rapidly. I mean, we were first hit in 2014 with the Sony cyber hack, and that's really what we had some suspicion as to North Korea's cyber activities and that it has capabilities, but the North Korean cyber hack of the Lazarus infiltration of the Sony film company studio was really to highlight how robust of a program it had, and then subsequently more robust attacks. And now we're seeing even the UN panel of experts and other organizations and reporting that North Korea has engaged in a variety of different cyber criminal activity, and it's helping offset sanctions losses in other areas from trade in coal and trade of other commodities. So some of the cyber activities that we've seen is theft in ATMs, theft in bank withdrawals, theft of cryptocurrencies. And it's not doing that alone. It's obviously using third country proxies, China, a number of countries in Southeast Asia, scattered throughout Asia, but China is one of the big ones, and the United States, and there needs to be a working group to think about how we can tactfully approach the countering North Korea's cyber criminal activity. And also the UN panel of experts needs to have a cyber criminal section in its report. I mean, those reports are evolving and changing, and when Cheongcheong hit, and then we automatically had a maritime section. So now these need to be reinvented and recalibrated to then target the areas where North Korea continues to conduct that criminal activity. With regards to if the North Korean economy is going to collapse, we've seen this time and time again with not only North Korea, but other countries, and how we have hoped or used sanctions as a thought sanctions would collapse economies. Sanctions don't collapse economies. Sanctions are there to be a tool to help a broader policy and a broader framework than come to a desired effect. So I don't see the North Korean economy collapsing with regards to sanctions. I do see sanctions as a tool, as an important instrumental tool to help the broader policy framework that would then lead us to another set of dialogue or talks. And we don't want those dialogues or talk and potentially lessening those sanctions, providing a sanctions relief program for North Korea, that then we are so desirous of talks that then we would compromise on our sanctions, and North Korea would cheat again and have this ripple effect where striking this balance between pressure and dialogue is very fine. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Juan, going back to you and talking about the question of potential provocations out of Pyongyang and out of Kim Jong-un in 2021, or just the unexpected coming out of this, what exactly is the readiness of the state of mind, really, of the Moon administration or South Korea in general to respond effectively to a provocation? Or would it be, again, as with the blowing up of the liaison center that South Korea so generously built for dialogue, only to see it sort of go up literally in ruin? An astonishing sort of assault, if you will, on dialogue out of North Korea. How much patience is there in South Korea for another provocation?
Well, I think many people, including me, we are saying that there is also possibility that North Korea will have this kind of provocation. We don't know exactly what kind of provocation they are planning for, but there are several reasons that North Korea choose to provocation rather than dialogue in near future. Because also Professor Huang mentioned that so-called head-on breakthrough line or direction that has been introduced the last year, December. And one of the main purpose and goal of this line is to so-called breaking down the U.S. sanction blockade scheme, and quotes. And also they introduced that they are saying that the world will witness a new strategic weapons. And I think because of the coronavirus situation, simply North Korea has postponed this kind of military activity. So, but we are seeing the last June, they have also capability and will to have a provocation. So I think we shouldn't rule out this provocation of the North Korea. And the second thing is that North Korea's issue itself is not the Biden's new administration's priority. We all know that. And usually domestic issue in the United States is top priority. And we are seeing how polarized the presidential election of the United States, and also United States has faced a huge COVID-19 crisis. So I don't think a new Biden administration has put the North Korea issue as their top priority. For that purpose, the North Korea needed to bring their issue onto the Biden's table and desk. And one of the ways that they used to North Korea to do that is to have this kind of provocation. We have experienced these kind of things for past several decades. And the Professor Hwang mentioned the start with the Obama administration and other previous the US administration. North Korea has to wait 2 or 3 months, and then they have these kind of provocations. And the third reason that I assume that the North Koreans might choose this provocation rather than dialogue is that North Korea is experiencing so-called triple distress. That is economic sanction, COVID-19, and the floods. So the time is not side with North Korea. They don't have enough time to wait this Biden's offer or the Biden's administration's the North Korean policy. So I think they are going to do something, and of course there's a high possibility of this provocation. And finally, and definitely, North Korea has need to do this ICBM test for make them operational. And North Korea's the last ICBM test was the November 2017, and since then they didn't have any kind of ICBM test, even though this October 10th, the 2 months before, and they showing the so-called Hudson 16, that is ICBM, but they haven't had any the test. So in order to being operational, they need to have this kind of a test. But I already point out that it's going to be a very huge challenge even for the North Korea if they do this kind of ICBM test. So I think still there is possibility to some kind of limited provocation against South Korea. And unfortunately, and Patrick, you mentioned that the South Korean government, and of course, I have a chance to talk with this issue with the South Korean government officials, and they acknowledge and they simply do not rule out the possibility of the North Koreans' provocation. But still, the South Korean government put the emphasis on dialogue, and they still advocate the end of a war declaration, and they are trying to persuade the new Biden administration to give us some kind of incentive to North Korea first. But still, I don't think North Korea is not ready to have any kind of dialogue unless United States, very publicly saying that there's a partial relief of sanction or this permanent halt of the ROK-US joint military exercise, and this kind of things that the North Korea has demanded in the last October in Sweden. And unless the United States has come up with this kind of demand, then North Korea has a very slight chance to come up with a negotiation table.
You reminded us, Dr. Pak, that the Biden administration should not be simply an Obama third term. Before there was strategic patience with the Obama administration, they were actually very actively negotiating, as you remember, a freeze, a deal on freezing the launch of long-range missiles. When that failed, the so-called Leap Day deal failed in the early months of Kim Jong-un kind of assuming his father's reins of power, then that sort of turned the dialogue very sour and made it very difficult politically and practically to kind of negotiate. So there was a lot more strategic patience after that.
Okay, Patrick, I think that's a very important point. I vividly remember that 2012, this Leap Day agreement, and before and after, of course, Obama administration policies, huge differences. And I was closely working with the South Korean government at the time. And also I have a frequently exchange with the Obama administration's officials. And unofficially, Obama administration has changed their policy toward North Korea. And they are thinking, not just thinking, but they are planning to have a so-called regime change after 2012 experience. And also the president-elect Biden, he has a very different statement about North Korea before 2012 and after 2012. It seems to be there are two Bidens. And he has a very strong and criticism after 2012 failed the agreement with North Korea. And also the important the Biden's government officials like Tony Blinken and Sullivan, they are saying they're very negative things about the North Korea after 2012.
Yes, there's no doubt that that they feel burned basically in terms of trying to engage North Korea. It's a very tough subject. It's one that South Korea keeps working on, and only with limited success, despite all the effort. I want to turn to Brad Roberts and bring back a couple of questions about deterrence from the perspective of potential provocations. One of them is what we might see as a provocation, of course, as a new long-range missile test or nuclear test. How important is it for North Korea militarily, do you think, to demonstrate that they actually can have the reentry vehicle sort of, sort of separated from a long-range three-stage rocket or another nuclear test that really demonstrates that they've got perhaps a hydrogen bomb capability, as they've called the last couple, or conversely, if there's a provocation from North Korea that we're trying to prevent, and you're trying to advise again a Biden-Moon sort of alliance on what we do. The things that we've done in the past, sending bombers to indicate that they better not tamper with anything because we could drop a weapon or use, as we did with taking out the Iranian General Soleimani, the Trump administration. I mean, there could be a very kind of tacit threat posed by just putting into theater certain systems. But those are exactly the kind of moves that North Korea has railed against and is looking to sort of undo as a way of a security guarantee. So how does North Korea, do you think, have to think about its nuclear deterrent issue? And how do we think about trying to prevent them from conducting a provocation, including possibly even limited use of force in the maritime theater or elsewhere?
Well, again, lots of good questions. Let me try and focus in on a couple of key points. One, I think our discussion of provocations and their likelihood doesn't fully account for North Korea's new nuclear status. When I hear people conjecture about the most troubling forms of provocation, the most troubling form is a return to 2010 that people can imagine. But I wonder why a North Korean leader committed to provoke by military means would revert to a pre-nuclear course of action. I'm not suggesting that in a provocation he would employ a nuclear weapon, but I think the provocation that's possible in the years ahead is one that demonstrates his complete confidence in his nuclear deterrent ability to protect North Korea against any form of significant retaliation for a lethal and potentially significantly lethal event. Remember, this is a man who's trying to turn the tide of history. He's not simply interested in surviving, he's interested in achieving an outcome to an historical and historic series of events on the peninsula, and is the final testing of his deterrent essential to his military success? I think not. He needn't have high confidence in deployed capabilities so long as they cause us to worry in a significant way. Politically, he requires a successful test of these capabilities. This is a part of how you impress people. This is a part of how you shake their confidence in their safety. So I see the tests as serving a psychological purpose much more than an operational military purpose. Now, how we respond, if we get into a tit for tat, he deploys some nuclear weapons, we deploy some nuclear weapons, we deploy some more missile defense, et cetera, he's in charge of that process. That's a fool's errand for us. I believe that the most powerful signal we could send focusing on nuclear deterrence would be to establish a new high-level consultative mechanism like the NATO Nuclear Planning Group, which is the defense ministers, and charge it with developing consultative and cooperative mechanisms for nuclear deterrence, whatever that might mean. And then to display operational capability to employ nuclear weapons in time of crisis and war, in time of war. I would not bring US nuclear weapons onto the Korean Peninsula, but I would create the storage facilities for them that would be ready to receive them. And I might think of bringing them as far as Guam, or at least practicing bringing them as far as Guam. Patrick, your question about bomber displays goes to the heart of the matter. North Korea has seen those bombers over and over and over again. And there's still a credible signal of if North Korea attacks the American homeland with nuclear weapons, retaliation's coming. The difficulty is in establishing the credibility of the threat to respond if the territory of an ally is struck as opposed to the American homeland. And for that, forward-based nuclear weapons or forward deployable nuclear weapons are key. So I think we should stop playing the game of tit for tat building up of offense and defense capability and make some shifts in our strategy and in our policy perspective, indicating that we take seriously the possibility of nuclear conflict on the peninsula. And if he thinks he can win, we'll disabuse him of that notion.
Terrific insights, Brad. I want to just now in the remaining just handful of minutes, just turn back to each one of you for kind of a closing thought and if possible, a sense of what you think might be what we've learned from Kim Jong-un after nearly a decade in office and power, having now had numerous summit meetings at the highest level, South Korea and North Korea, US and North Korea, and it's no longer the black hole that then CIA Director Bob Gates once called the North Korea intelligence problem, but it's probably also not the completely transparent, I understand it all now, that Donald Trump professed to Bob Woodward this past summer when Woodward was interviewing the president for his book Rage. It's probably somewhere in between a black hole and we know everything about Kim Jong-un and North Korea. So what do we think we know about what Kim Jong-un wants? Is it clear to you, Professor Wong?
I believe so, actually. Kim Jong-un is, was born in 1984, and he's just 30 years old, now very young. And I think that he expects to live up to the 70 or 80 years old. So he has an additional, 30 or 40 years. So I mean, he has a long time horizon. So he is now having the long-term survival strategy. As I mentioned that North Korea has, already declared the hand-drone breakthrough strategy last year. So that, which means that North Korea is now seeking a long-term survival strategy against the United States rather than, to be risky in the near future. So North Korea, the Kim Jong-un's perception was that the United States had no intention of lifting economic sanctions, even with the North Korea's promise to abandon the Yongbyon nuclear facility, like we have seen the Hanoi summit. That's I think that Kim Jong-un's perception. That's the reason why the Kim Jong-un, they decide to, adopt the long-time survival strategy. So now it seems to me that they now trying to bypass and overcome the sanctions to win the long-term confrontation. So he concluded, I believe, that the U.S. policy towards North Korea would not be changed in the near future. So as a result, so North Korea made it clear that it would not resume the nuclear negotiations in the way the United States wants, in the near future. So this is why the Kim Yo-jong, the Kim Jong-un's younger sister, also the deputy director of the North Korean Workers' Party, mentioned, last July, to the United States that the North Korea would not be involved again in the nuclear dialogue unless the United States changes its negotiation strategy. So it's now time for the North Korea to wait for the environment to change and just adapt to pursue the survival long-term survival strategy. I think that's the Kim Jong-un's intention for now.
Yes, thank you. And Andrew, even with respect to sanctions, I mean, what do we think we know about how the Kim regime thinks about the effectiveness, the impact, the challenge of external sanctions?
Well, just as you said, we've seen Kim Jong-un has been in power for more than a decade. He has met with foreign leaders. He has hosted foreign leaders. Where he's definitely no longer the child that we saw 10 years ago. He's a much more mature man. He's not going to be the attention-grabbing individual that we saw in the last couple of administrations. He's going to be more calculated, more strategic. Having the exposure to the outside world and the outside world having exposure to him, that mystique is not quite is still alluring, but he still like I said, he's much more mature. He knows what he understands how these sanctions works. He's gonna continue to be increasingly more savvy with his sanctions, as we've seen with the last military parade. He's displayed an impressive set of arsenal and as well as luxury goods that we haven't seen before. So North Korea will continue to reinvent itself as we continue to try to impose additional sanctions and designations and enforce those sanctions authorities. We're going to see a lot more cyber activity. Or we're going to attempt to try to find that cyber activity because North Korea is becoming increasingly savvy in terms of its sanctions circumvention using middlemen. And that's where we need working groups with China and our like-minded partners to come and enforce those sanctions to cut off those criminal activities using those middlemen and third-party locations. And North Korea, the cyber activity is going to be a big one. It's going to be it's going to help offset a lot of the losses from other sanctions areas, and that's going to continue to be a problem. And there is no way to negotiate that with North Korea unless we have our banks enforce more stringent measures to protect against money laundering activities and also develop software to prevent the cyber hacking. And we will need to coordinate with the international community in an effort to do that. Because it's going to be a problem. It's going to be here to stay. And both in terms of sanctions evasion writ large, whether they're trying to sell weapons abroad or they're trying to conduct in prohibitive commercial and economic trade or of the proliferation of cyber-related activities.
Unfortunately, I think you're absolutely right. And we're going to see those headlines in the coming years. And we're going to look back at this presentation right here and say, you were warned, we should have done more. Professor Park, what is your read on what we've learned, what you think we know now about Kim Jong-un in terms of diplomacy? Have we also matured and become more savvy about how to deal with North Korea?
Well, it is a very uncomfortable fact is that, there is no sign that the North Koreans will give up their nuclear weapons. And many people agree with me, even the so-called progressive, the scholars and politicians here in Korea, they are also saying that there's no chance that we can achieve so-called the CVID of the North Korea. Well, that's very uncomfortable fact. And I think Kim Jong-un, as Brett correctly mentioned that, and I don't think he will use his nuclear weapon as to consolidate and legitimize his own regime, because unlike his father or grandfather, he's not the first son. And also he didn't do anything for this DPRK so far. Only thing he can do is complete of nuclear capability. So for the domestic purpose, I don't think the Kim Jong-un will give up his nuclear weapon. And second thing is, I wanted to talk about these inter-Korean relations, and the South Korean government still have a high hope to resume this kind of a meaningful exchange with North Korea as we have experienced in year 2018. But I don't think North Korea will come up with some kind of a meaningful exchange with South Korea unless there is some kind of progress with the denuclearization talk with the United States. So far, it's going to be a very difficult situation and the circumstance that South Korea government has faced. And so I think always emphasize that we have to prepare and deter the North Korean threat first. So that's my usually recommendation to South Korean government. And also South Korean government needed to have some long breath. I mean, it takes time, as Professor Hwang mentioned, that it's not going to be resolved easily in sooner or later, and the head-on breakthrough, and very clearly mentioned that it's a long-term strategy. So it's going to take time. But at the same time, I'm kind of thinking another way that I just mentioned the triple distress that North Korea has faced. So I don't think they have enough time to wait and see this, what the Biden administration's, the North Korean policy. Rather, they wanted to put the pressure to change the policy to favor to North Korea. So that's why I keep saying that it's important to deter this possible, the North Korean's provocation.
Excellent. And briefly, Brad Roberts, what have we learned about nuclear deterrence and extended deterrence and dealing with North Korea from your perspective?
Well, we've learned that North Korea is resilient. We've learned that North Korea is thinking about strategy, and nuclear strategy is sophisticated. We've learned that our thinking about extended nuclear deterrence is dated. We've learned that we're uncomfortable thinking about the possibilities of an increased role for U.S. nuclear weapons at a time when the main thrust of U.S. nuclear strategy has been to decrease that role. So I think we've learned a lot.
Well, and I've learned a lot from all of you with this program. I really appreciate your expertise and joining us, Andrea and Brad, Wangong and Jiwon. You've been tremendous at providing answers to my multi-part questions, and I appreciate it. We're going to be separately from this program producing a written report that'll be published by Hudson in March, but in the meantime, I hope that this is viewed by many people around the world, in Korea and the United States in particular. But thanks to you, I think it was a great success. So thank you to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.